If you are within 10 years of retirement, the most dangerous word in finance may be balanced. I have watched people destroy 20 or 30 years of discipline with a portfolio that looked respectable, sounded prudent, and made complete sense right up to the point where it failed them. That is the part nobody tells you. A portfolio can look intelligent and still be built for the wrong season. And when the season changes, dignity disappears very fast. A long time ago, a man sat across from me with the kind of face I never forget: calm, responsible, slightly tired. The face of a man who had done what he was told for a very long time. His name was Daniel. He had spent more than 3 decades as an operations manager for a manufacturing company in the Midwest. He was not a gambler. He was not chasing hot tips. He had done the supposedly boring things that financial people love to praise. He saved steadily. He avoided stupid debt. He reinvested. He trusted the process. By the time I met him, he and his wife had built a little over $2 million. He believed he was nearly done. He showed me the allocation his advisory firm had built for him. A familiar picture: a large stock allocation for growth, a bond allocation for stability, a layer of funds inside other funds. Plenty of language about discipline, diversification, and staying the course. I asked him one question: what exactly is this portfolio designed to survive? He looked at me like no one had ever asked it that way before. That reaction is common. Most people are sold return projections, not survival plans. They are shown charts from friendly decades. They are told that patience solves everything. They are told volatility is the price of admission. They are told that if they keep faith, the market will reward them in the end. That advice sounds wise when time is abundant. It becomes dangerous when time is short. I told Daniel something that made him uncomfortable. I said the problem in markets is not simply whether assets go up or down. The deeper problem is whether the structure underneath them is sound. When debt has been building for too long, when leverage is layered on leverage, when optimism has become a substitute for cash flow, conventional portfolios stop being balanced. They become concentrated bets on normality. And normality does not always stay in the room. Daniel nodded politely. Then he told me his advisor said the economy was resilient. Housing was healthy. Credit markets were deep. And diversified investors would be rewarded for staying invested. He wanted to believe that. Most people do. A comforting sentence is often more attractive than a true one. So he stayed where he was. At first, it made him feel clever. Markets kept rising. His statements looked better. The model looked vindicated. Vacations were discussed. A smaller home near the water was discussed. The future started being spoken about as though it had already arrived. Then the floor went missing. When the crisis fully hit, his portfolio did not behave like a balanced machine. It behaved like a trap. The stocks were hit. The funds that were supposed to soften the blow did less than promised. Fear spread faster than reason. By the time the damage was done, a lifetime of careful behavior had been cut almost in half. He did not lose because he was foolish. He lost because he was standing inside a structure built for fair weather when a storm arrived. That distinction matters. A lot of decent people get hurt not because they are reckless, but because they were handed a map that only works when roads are dry. I want you to understand what I mean by that, because the issue now is bigger than a normal recession and bigger than a routine bear market. We are living late in a long debt buildup that changes what deserves to be owned. People like to talk about the economy as if it were mysterious. In broad terms, it is not. It runs on output, credit, and confidence. Output is straightforward. Are people and businesses producing more value over time, or are they not? Credit is what allows tomorrow's demand to be borrowed into today. Confidence is what persuades everyone that the promises attached to that credit will still be honored later. In ordinary periods, that machine can wobble and still recover. Rates move, spending cools, a recession shows up. Weak businesses get exposed. Then the cycle resets and the machine keeps going. That is the short rhythm, but there is a slower rhythm under it, and that rhythm is where real damage gets born. Over long stretches of time, debt accumulates faster than the productive base beneath it. Governments borrow because promises are politically easy and discipline is politically expensive. Consumers borrow because modern life sells convenience first and consequences later. Corporations borrow because leverage flatters earnings until it doesn't. For years, this arrangement can look efficient. Then one day the interest bill becomes a character in the story. That is when the conversation changes at the late edge of a long debt cycle. You start seeing the same signs again and again. More money is required to create each additional unit of growth. Asset prices become more dependent on easy credit than on underlying economics. People stop asking whether things are cheap or dear and begin asking only whether liquidity will continue. That is not health. That is dependency wearing a necktie. When a country, a household, or a financial system reaches that point, the exit's narrow. There are only a few ways out. Debts can be defaulted on, debts can be restructured, or the currency can be quietly made worth less. So the debt burden shrinks in real terms. The third path is the favorite because it is the least honest and the most politically tolerable. It spreads pain without sending an engraved invitation. It does not announce itself by saying savers will be punished. It arrives dressed in cleaner language: support, liquidity, stability, emergency measures, accommodation relief. But if the purchasing power of the currency is being thinned out, savers are still paying. That is the point that most conventional portfolios are not built to respect. A paper claim is not automatically safe just because it has been called conservative for 30 years. A bond can be safe from default and still unsafe from inflation. A stock index can survive nominally while the owner loses badly in real purchasing power. A retirement statement can recover on paper while a retirement life never does. That is why I care so much about what happens near the end of these long cycles. They are not just financial events, they are life events. They decide whether a person gets freedom when they need it or whether old age gets traded back for labor. History is not identical each time, but it rhymes with enough force to be useful. In the 1930s, a great many paper claims that looked respectable became far less respectable under pressure. In the 1930s, people learned a different lesson. Even when the system remains standing, inflation can quietly confiscate years of work. A person can think he owns stable assets while the spending power behind those assets is being hollowed out month by month. That kind of loss is especially cruel because it does not always feel dramatic at first. It feels like confusion. It feels like wondering why groceries, insurance, taxes, maintenance, and medical bills all seem to move faster than the account meant to fund them. It feels like being told everything is fine because the numbers on the page are larger while your actual life keeps getting tighter. I heard from a widow years after a crisis who explained it better than most economists ever do. Her husband had retired with enough money to feel secure, not extravagant, just secure. They thought the hard part was over. Then markets cracked, correlations rose, and the holdings that were supposed to steady the ship did not do what they had promised in the brochure. The account value fell, but the financial loss was only part of the damage. Her husband began waking in the middle of the night to check balances. Meals got smaller. His mood darkened. Every future plan turned into a math problem. He started treating ordinary expenses like threats. He was not mourning luxury, he was mourning certainty. She told me the cruelest part was not simply the loss of money, it was the loss of peace. That sentence stayed with me. People who have never been near a true financial squeeze think the issue is greed. They imagine people are upset because they cannot buy a second home or fly first class. Often the real pain is smaller and sadder than that. It is a grown man wondering whether he waited too long to retire. It is a couple delaying medical care because the deductible no longer looks manageable. It is someone doing everything responsibly and still discovering that responsibility alone is not a shield when the architecture fails. So when I say your portfolio must be built to survive, I do not mean built to win cocktail party arguments. I mean built to preserve purchasing power, sleep, flexibility, and dignity. When the system becomes less friendly, that requires a different center of gravity. In periods like this, I come back to 4 kinds of holdings, not because they are exciting, because they remain useful when optimism breaks. The first is physical precious metal, especially gold, with a smaller place for silver. I am not talking about paper claims that merely imitate metal. I am not talking about clever structures that add counterparty risk back into the very asset people are buying to escape it. I mean metal that is actually owned, actually allocated, and not dependent on somebody else's promise being honored in a panic. Most of the time. People dislike that answer because gold does not flatter the ego. It does not produce a glossy spreadsheet. It does not make you feel modern. It sits there. That is precisely its virtue. Insurance is supposed to look boring before the accident. When a currency is being stretched, when confidence in paper promises is thinning, gold does not need a heroic story. It only needs people to remember that printed claims and real scarcity are not the same thing. There are long periods when gold does very little. Fine. A fire extinguisher is also unimpressive until smoke appears under the door. I would not build an entire life around gold, and I would not pretend it is the same as owning a great business. But if the monetary foundation is under strain, physical precious metal deserves a seat in the room, not for drama, for ballast. For many people, something in the range of 10 to 15% of liquid wealth is enough to matter without becoming obsession. Coins and bars from reputable sources. Allocated storage if that suits the size of the position. Simplicity over novelty. Bullion over collectibles. Protection over performance theater. The second category is ownership in businesses with genuine pricing power. This is where people make a serious mistake. They hear that stocks can be dangerous late in a cycle and conclude that every business claim should be treated the same way. That is lazy thinking. A weak business and a strong business do not become equal just because both trade on an exchange. When inflation rises or capital gets more expensive, the difference between a real business and a fashionable story gets exposed very quickly. I want businesses that can raise prices without destroying demand. Businesses that sell something customers must keep buying. Businesses with brands, distribution, switching costs, regulated frameworks, or hard assets that allow them to pass through rising costs instead of absorbing them helplessly. If soap, medicine, electricity, waste removal, food distribution, and certain forms of infrastructure become more expensive to provide. The right businesses do not simply complain, they reprice. That is what protects the owner. A company with pricing power is not merely earning revenue, it is defending purchasing power on your behalf. The broad market can be full of businesses that need cheap money, forgiving customers, and a sunny economic backdrop to justify their valuations. I have no interest in depending on that kind of kindness. I would rather own businesses that keep sending cash even when the mood changes. That is why I like the idea of concentrating this bucket in companies with durable products, durable habits, and durable economics. Consumer staples, certain healthcare businesses, certain utilities, select infrastructure operators, companies that have proved over long stretches that they can keep paying and keep raising what they pay, not glamorous useful. For many households, this is the largest bucket. Roughly 30 to 35% makes sense if selected with care, not dozens of random names, not a basket assembled by fashion. A smaller group of understandable businesses with balance sheets, cash flows, and the kind of demand that does not vanish because a commentator turns gloomy. The third category is short duration government paper and cash equivalents. People often underestimate this one because they confuse dullness with weakness. Cash is not there to impress anybody. Cash is there to give you options when other people are cornered. In every genuine panic, liquidity becomes intelligence. People who were considered aggressive geniuses a year earlier suddenly become sellers at terrible prices. Not because they are stupid, but because they have obligations, margin calls, redemptions, maturities, fear. They need money now, and the market punishes need. If you are liquid in that moment, the world looks different. You do not have to beg the market for mercy. You can choose, you can wait, you can buy. That is an enormous advantage. Short treasury bills and high-quality treasury backed cash vehicles are not designed to make you feel rich. They are designed to keep principal intact and to preserve maneuverability. They are the dry powder that turns a crisis from a personal disaster into a field of opportunity. I do not want a retiree reaching for yield in fragile structures just to earn a little more while the cycle is deteriorating underneath them. That extra yield can be the most expensive income they ever chase. I would rather know that 20 to 25% of the portfolio can be touched, used, redeployed, and trusted in a difficult environment. There is psychological value here too. People make better decisions when they do not feel trapped. They are less likely to sell a good asset badly if they have liquid reserves already in place. They are less likely to panic simply because they can see breathing room. The fourth category is productive, real assets. By that I mean assets that continue to provide something people need in the physical world, farmland. Certain rental property, select infrastructure, real assets tied to shelter, food, movement, storage, and other necessities that remain necessities whether markets are cheerful or not. I like productive things. That preference never leaves me. But late in a debt cycle, I want productivity anchored to something tangible. I do not want fantasy productivity. I do not want hoped for economics scheduled for some beautiful future that depends on rates, sentiment, and easy refinancing. I want present usefulness. Farmland grows what people eat. Well, located rental housing answers a need that does not disappear because the stock market is disappointed. Infrastructure tied to everyday activity retains relevance because society still has to function even while balance sheets are being repaired. These assets may fluctuate, and some forms of ownership are far better than others, but they are connected to real-world demand in a way that paper abstractions often are not. For many people, 10 to 15% here is enough. Some will own it directly. Others will use carefully selected public vehicles. The important thing is not the wrapper. The important thing is whether the underlying asset produces something enduring. Now put those four buckets together and you begin to see the outline of a portfolio built for a harsher climate, a measured allocation to physical precious metal, a larger allocation to pricing, power businesses, a serious reserve of short government paper and true liquidity, a meaningful allocation to productive real assets. That core does not need to occupy every last dollar. There is room outside it for personal expertise, age tax reality, and even selective risk, if the owner truly understands what he is doing. But the center has to change. That is the whole point. Most people hear an argument like this and immediately make one of two mistakes. The first mistake is paralysis. They agree in private, then do nothing in practice. They wait for perfect clarity, which never comes. They wait for unanimous expert approval, which never comes. They wait for a cleaner signal, which usually arrives only after prices have already moved and damage has already been done. The second mistake is theatrical overreaction. They sell everything in one emotional burst. move clumsily, buy what they do not understand, and turn caution into chaos. I do not admire either response. What I admire is orderly repositioning. If I were advising a family that recognized itself in what I am saying, I would start with timeline, not market forecast timeline. How long before this money must begin carrying your life? If the answer is 20 years, the urgency is lower. You still need prudence, but you have the gift of time. If the answer is 7 years, 5 years, or less, then every large unexamined assumption inside the portfolio becomes more dangerous. Next, I would sell what is clearly non-essential, speculation disguised as investment, businesses that require a perfect future, holdings purchased because they were rising rather than because they were sound. Anything that depends more on enthusiasm than on economics deserves early suspicion. After that, I would begin building the 4 buckets deliberately, not dramatically. Start the precious metal position. Begin assembling the pricing. Power business position. Move idle cash and fragile fixed income exposure toward short-duration government paper. Add productive real assets carefully, rather than buying whatever carries the right label. Spread that work over months if needed. Let the repositioning be systematic enough that you are not trying to win a game of short-term prediction. Prediction is a poor substitute for preparation. The media will not help you much. During this process, if markets bounce while you are becoming more defensive, you will be made to feel foolish. Friends will talk about what is working this quarter. Advisors, whose business models depend on keeping assets in motion, will give you speeches about discipline that somehow always conclude with you owning the products that pay them. Ignore the performance theater. The question is not whether a speculative corner of the market can levitate for another 6 months. The question is whether your life savings are arranged to survive a period in which debt, inflation, valuation, and confidence all begin arguing with one another at the same time. That is a much more serious question. I will make it even simpler. Look at every position you own and ask, if the next chapter is defined not by abundance but by stress, what is this thing expected to do for me? Will it preserve purchasing power? Will it keep paying? Will it give me flexibility? Will it hold up if the currency is weakened? If refinancing gets tighter? If fear rises? If optimism leaves? If the answer is unclear, that is already useful information. A portfolio does not become safe because the owner is attached to it. It becomes safer only when the underlying assets deserve trust. This is why I have so little patience for the phrase, stay the course, when it is used lazily. A course toward a cliff is still a course. Discipline matters enormously. But discipline applied to a bad structure just helps you stay loyal to your own damage. The right kind of discipline is not blind. It is adaptive without being hysterical. It notices when the environment that rewarded one kind of portfolio is no longer the environment in front of you. I believe we are much closer to that kind of turning point than most people appreciate. Not because I enjoy grim forecasts, I do not. Not because collapse makes for exciting conversation. It does. But that is irrelevant. I care because late cycle mistakes are rarely repaired by optimism alone. A 30-year-old can recover from many things. A 62-year-old with a planned retirement date cannot recover from the same loss with the same ease. Time changes the math. It also changes the emotional cost of being wrong. That is why I would act before the headlines become unanimous. The great wealth transfers do not begin with trumpets. They begin quietly. First, valuations stop being forgiving. Then refinancing gets harder. Then weak structures begin needing rescue. Then policymakers respond in ways that look supportive in the short run but corrosive in the long run. Then savers discover that what looked diversified was simply a collection of claims tied to the same underlying vulnerability. By the time the crowd agrees on what happened, the repricing has usually done its work. I do not want you learning that lesson from inside the event. I would rather you learn it while you still have room to move. There may still be time to do that, maybe not years of time, but enough time to replace passivity with structure. Enough time to stop treating retirement as a return target and begin treating it as a protection problem. Enough time to say that a life of work deserves something sturdier than hope wrapped in quarterly statements. If I were in your chair, I would not spend the next week arguing online about forecasts. I would open the account, I would look at every line, I would decide which holdings belong in a world of monetary strain and debt stress and which do not. Then I would build the portfolio that should have existed all along, not the one designed to look normal, the one designed to keep me free.